A love triangle that turns deadly. Miami, Florida, Valentine's Day. A day of romance, passion, and devotion. Until it wasn't. When first responders entered the penthouse of Jordan Blake, they expected to find a crime of passion, maybe a robbery gone wrong. But what they discovered shattered every assumption. The body of the 32-year-old investment banker lay motionless, a crimson stain pooling across the marble floor. The city skyline stretched behind him, its glittering lights mocking the silence of death. His wife, Layla Crawford Blake, had planned a special evening, a candlelit dinner, a table set for two. Instead, she returned home to find her husband lifeless, a bullet lodged in his chest, and a single glass of wine untouched beside him. The roses she had left earlier sat unopened on the counter, their fragrance hanging in the air like a cruel reminder of what the night was supposed to be. But this wasn't an ordinary crime of passion. The evidence didn't point to a jealous rival or an opportunistic thief. It led to someone closer, someone who had shared countless family dinners, whispered words of advice, and stood beside the couple as they exchanged vows. Vivian Crawford, Layla's own stepmother, a name whispered through Miami's elite circles, a woman known for power, elegance, and influence. She had built an empire in real estate, her name synonymous with wealth and prestige. But behind the polished facade, there was something else, something that no one had dared to suspect. The affair had been buried deep, a secret that should have died the moment Jordan placed a ring on Layla's finger. But love, obsession, and rejection have never been known to stay quiet. As investigators traced the final moments of Jordan Blake, the story that unraveled wasn't about love at all. It was about control, desire that refused to be ignored, a betrayal so personal, so consuming, that it ended in cold-blooded murder. By the time the truth surfaced, it was too late. A marriage destroyed, a family in ruins, a woman behind bars, and a question that lingered in the aftermath. Was this always the end, or could someone have stopped it before the first bullet was fired? Miami, Florida, where power is currency and reputation is everything. At the heart of this story lies four people, each bound by ambition, desire, and choices that would change their lives forever. A stepmother, a stepdaughter, a husband, and a man who knew how to make things disappear. Vivian Crawford, 47, the powerhouse in heels. There are two kinds of people in Miami's elite, those who inherit wealth and those who build it from nothing. Vivian Crawford was the latter, a woman who walked into the world of real estate with nothing but drive and an instinct for power. She didn't just sell luxury properties, she owned them. The ocean view penthouses, the sprawling waterfront mansions, the secluded estates where the city's richest whispered their secrets. Vivian knew them all, and she knew the people inside them too. Her name carried weight in Miami's most exclusive circles. To the public, she was sharp, fearless, and untouchable. To her stepdaughter, she was something else entirely. A woman who played the role of a devoted mother, but always kept one foot outside the family, as if love was a transaction. She had married into wealth, but she never played the part of a wife in the traditional sense. Her husband had been older, a man who appreciated her beauty and business mind. When he passed, she inherited more than money. She inherited influence. But there was one thing she couldn't buy, and when she saw it in her stepdaughter's hands, a love she could never have, she didn't look away. Layla Crawford Blake, 27, the rising star. Layla had been raised in two worlds, the polished, calculated existence of high society and the relentless pursuit of success that came with it. She had seen how power worked, how reputations were made and broken. Unlike her stepmother, she didn't chase status, she earned it. A corporate attorney by profession, Layla had built a name for herself in Miami's legal world. Clients trusted her, not just because of her last name, but because she was brilliant. The kind of woman who walked into a boardroom and made people listen. She had everything that mattered, a career she fought for, a marriage built on love, and a future she could see clearly. But love has blind spots. And when the warnings were there, Layla never saw them for what they really were. Jordan Blake, 32, the man. Everyone wanted to know, if success had a face, it was Jordan Blake. Tall, confident, effortlessly charming. He knew how to make people feel like they mattered. It was what made him good at his job, what made him unstoppable in Miami's high-stakes financial world. As an investment banker, he was the man who made fortunes grow. He closed deals in rooms with city views, shook hands over dinners that cost more than some people's rent. He understood wealth not just as a number, but as a language. He was the man who had everything: the career, the influence, the respect, and, most importantly, a woman who loved him without condition. But what he didn't see, or maybe refused to see, was that his success came with a cost. He had never wanted to be a player in someone else's game, but by the time he realized he was caught in one, it was too late. Trey "Shark" Coleman, the one you call when no one else can help. In Miami, problems don't always go to the police. Some problems require a different kind of solution. That's where Trey Coleman came in. Most people never knew his full name. They just knew him as Shark, a man who could clean up a mess before anyone knew it existed. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but when people needed something handled, something that couldn't be traced, something that needed to disappear, they called him. The thing about Trey was, he never cared why people needed his services. A missing document, a changed record, a conversation that never happened. He handled it all. But then Vivian called, and what she needed wasn't just a favor. It was a problem that couldn't be erased. Miami, 2019. The moment Layla Crawford introduced her fiancé Jordan Blake to her family, the night was already set in motion. A new face at an elite gathering, another polished handshake, another name added to Miami's circle of influence. At first glance, he belonged. Successful, confident, effortless in his charm. He was a man who had learned how to move through wealth like he had been born into it. Vivian Crawford noticed that immediately. As guests mingled under the glow of chandeliers, Layla stood beside Jordan, proud and glowing. The perfect couple, one step away from marriage. But as the night unfolded, Vivian watched more than she should have. Her stepdaughter was engaged to a man who reminded her of everything she once had. Vivian had built her success with sharp instincts and an unshakable presence. She had played the game better than anyone, and she had won. But power doesn't replace youth. It doesn't replace the rush of being desired, of being seen. And for the first time in years, someone saw her. What started as polite conversation soon became something else entirely. Dinners at the Crawford estate stretched longer than usual. A casual joke here, a knowing remark there. Jordan's laughter came easy, but Vivian listened too closely. When she spoke, he responded, not just out of respect, but with genuine engagement. It was subtle. At first, then it wasn't. Vivian, always in control, began pushing boundaries she knew she shouldn't. It was small things, her hand lingering on his shoulder, just a second longer than necessary, the way she leaned in during conversations. A compliment that meant more than it should. Jordan never stopped her. Maybe he didn't notice. Maybe he did. By early 2020, the shift was undeniable. The first time it happened, it wasn't planned. It wasn't some orchestrated scheme. It was a moment that neither of them stopped. A private conversation after a gala, the room emptied, the city lights reflecting against the glass. Vivian, as poised as ever, spoke about life, about ambition, about how people pretend love lasts forever. Jordan listened, drawn in. There was an intensity in her voice, one he didn't hear from Layla. That night, he didn't walk away. From then on, they found reasons to be alone. It was reckless, but that was part of the appeal. A secret that lived between glances across dinner tables, in the brief touch of hands when no one was looking. They moved carefully. Vivian wasn't careless. She had too much to lose. Luxury hotels, out-of-town business trips, places where no one would question their presence together. The stolen hours never felt like enough, and yet, each time, it became harder to stop. Jordan told himself it meant nothing, just a thrill, a mistake that could be undone. But Vivian didn't see it that way. She had convinced herself of one thing. Jordan was never supposed to belong to Layla. A mistake like this doesn't stay hidden forever. In late 2020, Vivian learned something that changed everything. She was pregnant. It wasn't supposed to happen. She had been careful, always in control. But this was something she couldn't manipulate. For weeks, she told no one. She ran through every scenario, every outcome. Jordan couldn't know. If he did, he would leave her stepdaughter. He would choose her. He had to. But then reality set in. A child would expose everything. The life she had built, the respect, the power, it would crumble. The image she had cultivated for years would turn into something else entirely. And so, in silence, she ended it. The pregnancy, the future she had convinced herself was meant to be, she erased it. But the choice didn't free her. It changed her. Vivian didn't let go. She couldn't. Ending the pregnancy didn't erase the connection she believed was real. It deepened it. By the time Jordan told her the affair was over, that it could never happen again, Vivian had already decided. He didn't get to walk away. Not from her. Not ever. Miami, February 2021. The wedding of Layla Crawford and Jordan Blake was the kind of event that made headlines. A high-profile ceremony in a luxury waterfront estate, attended by the city's elite, politicians, CEOs, celebrities. The kind of wedding people whispered about long after the last champagne glass was emptied. Layla was breathtaking in an elegant, custom-designed gown, the kind that only a select few could afford. Jordan stood beside her, the perfect groom, polished, composed, a man with a promising future. The air was filled with admiration, envy, and anticipation for what seemed to be the perfect union. Somewhere in the crowd, Vivian Crawford smiled. She gave her toasts. She posed for photographs. She played the role of the devoted stepmother flawlessly. But inside, something had shifted. This was never supposed to happen. Vivian watched as Jordan slipped a ring onto her stepdaughter's finger, as he held her close under the chandeliers, as he whispered things into her ear that should have belonged to someone else. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. Everything that had happened between them, the secrets, the nights behind closed doors, the whispered promises, all of it had been discarded. Jordan had chosen, and he hadn't chosen her. After the wedding, Layla and Jordan moved into a penthouse overlooking the bay, a home fit for the power couple they had become. A new chapter, a fresh start. For Layla, life couldn't have been more perfect. She was married to the man she adored. Her career was flourishing. She was surrounded by love and admiration. And then, she found out she was pregnant. She shared the news with friends, her colleagues. There were celebrations, well wishes, excitement for what lay ahead. But when she told Vivian, the reaction wasn't what she expected. There was no joy, no excitement, no warm embrace. Vivian barely spoke, a polite smile, a murmured congratulations, and then nothing. Layla thought it was strange, but she had no reason to question it. She had no way of knowing that just weeks earlier, Jordan had ended the affair for good. It happened in Vivian's office, behind the heavy oak doors, where so many of Miami's biggest deals had been made. She had called him there under the pretense of business, a discussion about property investments, something easy, something neutral. But from the moment he stepped inside, she made it clear this wasn't about business. She spoke about the past, their connection, everything they had been, and then she made him an offer, a new life, a future with her, more money than he could ever need, power, influence, things he would never have to work for again. All he had to do was leave Layla. Jordan didn't hesitate. It's over. The words cut through the space between them. Final. Absolute. Vivian didn't move, didn't react. He thanked her for the business opportunity and walked away. And that was when Vivian realized something that sent a chill through her entire body. Jordan had never been hers, not for a second, and he never would be. After that, Vivian changed. She no longer hid behind business formalities. She didn't care who noticed. She showed up at Jordan's office unannounced, waiting in the lobby for hours, sent late-night messages reminding him of their secret moments, left expensive gifts at his doorstep, each one more extravagant than the last. She told herself he just needed time, that he would see what he was throwing away. But Jordan never responded, not to the messages, not to the gifts, not to her presence. To him, she no longer existed, and that was something Vivian Crawford was never going to accept. Miami, June 2021. By the time Vivian Crawford made her final decision, there was nothing left to consider. Jordan Blake had made his choice. He had walked away without hesitation, without regret, without looking back. And that was unacceptable. For months, she had tried to reach him. late-night messages left unanswered, lavish gifts returned unopened, calls ignored. He had erased her, so she would do the same to him. If she couldn't have him, no one could. Vivian had always been a woman who knew how to get what she wanted. She had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, controlling the market with strategy and precision. This was no different. She reached out to someone who specialized in fixing problems, the kind that couldn't be solved in boardrooms. His name was Trey "Shark" Coleman. For the right price, he could make anything disappear: documents, assets, people. They met in a private lounge, tucked inside a high-end club where conversations like these were nothing new. She kept it simple: a gun, no questions asked. Trey didn't need an explanation. He just needed the money, and Vivian had plenty of it. Within 48 hours, the deal was done. Layla was out of town for the weekend, visiting a college friend in Palm Beach. Jordan was alone in the penthouse. Vivian knew this. She parked 3 blocks away, stepping out of her car with a calmness that came only when a decision was final. She didn't need a key. She knew the security system, the access codes, every blind spot in the building. She had spent nights here before. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. A silence stretched between every floor, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. Then, the doors opened. Jordan was exactly where she expected him to be. The living room, TV on, a drink in his hand, relaxed, unaware. She stepped inside, closing the door without a sound. He sensed her presence before he saw her. A pause. He turned his head. Realization struck him fast. Shock, disbelief, then something else, something unreadable. Vivian? She didn't speak. The weight of the gun pressed against her palm. Her heartbeat slowed. Everything she had convinced herself of, every reason, every justification, it all came down to this moment. Jordan stood up. He took one step toward her. She pulled the trigger. The sound swallowed the room. Jordan staggered backward, his body hitting the edge of the couch before collapsing to the floor. A crimson stain spread across the white carpet. For a moment, she just stood there, watching, waiting. Then she turned. The door closed behind her as if nothing had happened. Vivian didn't run. She didn't have to. Everything had been planned. No cameras, no witnesses, no evidence that could trace back to her. By the time authorities found him, she was already gone. But murder has a way of leaving a trail. And for someone like Vivian, someone who had built a life on control, secrecy, and power, she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated what people would do when they started asking questions. Miami, 3:47 a.m. The call came in just before dawn. A 911 dispatcher answered to the sound of a woman sobbing. The words came in between gasps, but the message was clear. A man was dead, shot inside his home. By the time detectives arrived at the penthouse, crime scene tape was already stretched across the entrance. Officers worked methodically, sectioning off the area as forensic teams moved inside. The body of Jordan Blake lay in the living room. A single gunshot wound to the chest, another to the head. No signs of forced entry, no weapons left behind. Detective Michael Reyes had worked homicide for 15 years. He had seen enough to know this wasn't random. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, a break-in, or an act of desperation. This was personal. The problem? Jordan had no known enemies. The early hours of an investigation are crucial. The longer a case goes unsolved, the harder it becomes to catch the killer. Detectives worked fast, piecing together the final moments of Jordan Blake's life. No security footage inside the penthouse. The building's residents valued privacy, and Jordan's unit had no interior cameras. The front door showed no forced entry. Whoever came in that night was either let in willingly or knew how to bypass security. His wife, Layla, had an alibi. She had been out of town, visiting a friend in Palm Beach. She had no idea her husband was dead until she walked into the crime scene herself. So, who wanted him dead? The answer came faster than expected. The first lead, a car that shouldn't have been there. Detectives canvassed the area, speaking to residents, security staff, and nearby businesses. One thing stood out. A luxury black Mercedes had been seen near the building around 10:30 p.m. The building's private garage had restricted access, but a street camera captured the vehicle parked a few blocks away. It didn't belong to Jordan. It didn't belong to any known visitors that night. But the license plate? It was registered to Vivian Crawford, Jordan's stepmother. The moment her name surfaced, the case took a turn. Following the digital trail, Miami's homicide unit had solved enough cases to know the truth is always buried in data. They subpoenaed Jordan's phone records and Vivian's financial transactions. What they found confirmed what had been whispered about in private circles. Vivian's calls and messages to Jordan, 156 missed calls in the months leading up to the murder. Dozens of unanswered messages. Multiple attempts to contact him after the wedding, all ignored. The transaction that couldn't be explained. 3 days before Jordan's murder, Vivian made a large cash withdrawal, $25,000. The money was traced to Trey "Shark" Coleman, a known under-the-table fixer. Trey had a reputation in Miami's underground. He wasn't someone who asked questions. He was someone people called when they needed something handled quietly. Detectives didn't need to guess why Vivian had sent him money. The interrogation that changed everything. With enough evidence to connect Vivian to Trey Coleman, detectives brought him in for questioning. At first, he refused to talk. A man like Trey didn't confess. He had spent years avoiding prison by knowing when to stay silent. But this time was different. They had bank statements showing Vivian's payment. They had surveillance footage placing her near the crime scene. They had phone records linking her to Jordan in the weeks leading up to his death. Trey wasn't willing to take the fall for someone else's crime. It didn't take long for him to crack. His confession was simple. Vivian reached out to him. She wanted a gun. She paid in cash, no questions asked. And most importantly, she made it clear it wasn't for protection. It was for revenge. When detectives arrived at Vivian's estate, she was already waiting for them, dressed in silk, sipping her morning coffee as if nothing had happened. The moment they mentioned Jordan's murder, she barely reacted. Calm, unshaken. She denied everything. "I was checking on Jordan, that's all." They showed her the surveillance footage. "I drove by, but I never went inside." They presented the financial records, the money sent to Trey Coleman. Her smile didn't waver. He was an investment consultant. And then they showed her the signed statement from Trey himself. Silence. For the first time, Vivian had nothing to say, and that was when she asked for a lawyer. But the damage was done. The woman who once controlled Miami's real estate market now had a different title, the prime suspect in a murder investigation. Miami-Dade Police Department, Interrogation Room 4. The room was silent except for the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. A small camera mounted in the corner recorded everything. A single sheet of paper, her signed Miranda waiver, sat untouched on the metal table. Vivian Crawford was finally out of excuses. For hours, she had denied any involvement, defiant, poised, unshaken. But the evidence was airtight. Her car spotted near Jordan's penthouse, phone records placing her in the area at the time of the murder, financial transactions linking her to Trey "Shark" Coleman, the man who sold her the gun. And then, Trey's confession. Detectives had heard every excuse imaginable, but this was different. Vivian wasn't an impulsive killer. She was a woman who had spent her life controlling outcomes. Now, she had lost control. The weight of it pressed down on her, and then finally, she exhaled. Her fingers traced the edge of the table, slow and deliberate. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. But something inside her had shifted. And then she spoke. "He was mine." Her voice was steady, not frantic, not regretful, just certain. "I gave him everything, more than she ever could." She was talking about Layla. Detective Michael Reyes leaned forward, waiting. He had interrogated hundreds of suspects in his career. This wasn't remorse. It wasn't even an admission of guilt. It was ownership. "He told me it was over," she continued, her nails tapping against the table. "Like I was a mistake, like I didn't matter." She let the words settle. "I mattered." Her tone sharpened, low, deliberate. "I was supposed to be the woman in his life, not her. I never planned to kill him." She sat back in her chair, as if the weight of the truth had just hit her. "I just wanted to talk," she murmured. To remind him, Detective Reyes folded his arms. "Remind him of what?" A pause. "That he loved me," she whispered. She said it like a fact, as if reality had bent to match the version in her head. Detectives let the silence stretch. Then Reyes spoke. "So, why did you pull the trigger?" Her jaw clenched. Her breathing slowed. "He turned his back on me," she said finally. And there it was. Not regret. Not an accident. A choice. By the time Layla Crawford Blake was brought into the station for questioning, she wasn't there as a suspect. She was there as a widow. She sat in a separate room, arms wrapped around herself. The weight of exhaustion clung to her, though she hadn't shed a tear since stepping inside. She had been told the truth. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a business rival. It wasn't random violence. It was her stepmother. Layla had built her life on facts, on legal arguments, on evidence. None of it could explain why the woman she trusted had stolen the man she loved. She had questions, but she already knew there were no answers that would ever make sense. The trial and sentencing, Miami-Dade Criminal Court, August 2022. The courtroom was silent as Vivian Crawford entered, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit. No designer gowns, no power heels, no perfectly styled hair. This was not the woman Miami once admired. This was a convicted killer. She sat at the defense table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Across the room, Layla Crawford Blake sat in the front row, the weight of loss pressing into her shoulders. 6 months pregnant when her husband was murdered, a widow before she ever held their child. This moment wasn't about justice. Justice would never bring Jordan back. It was about consequences. Vivian had always controlled the narrative. Even now, in the face of life imprisonment, she refused to let the courts turn her into a spectacle. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. No trial, no drawn-out proceedings, no witnesses called to the stand. She sat before the judge, hands steady, voice clear. Guilty. She gave no excuses, no explanations. She had already said everything she needed to say. The sentence was immediate, life in prison, no possibility of parole. Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if she had already accepted her fate long before the gavel struck. For Trey Coleman, the outcome was different. He had cooperated with authorities, providing the testimony that sealed Vivian's fate. But cooperation didn't erase his crime. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty for his role in supplying the murder weapon. The judge handed down 7 years, a lighter sentence than many expected, but enough to make it clear. Even those who stand in the shadows don't walk away untouched. Trey showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He had done what was necessary to protect himself, but in Miami's underground circles, his name would never hold the same weight again. There was nothing left for Layla Crawford Blake in Miami, the city that had once been her home, her future, the place where she built her career and planned her life with Jordan. Now, it was just a graveyard of memories. The penthouse was sold. The office where Jordan had built his empire was cleared out. She packed what mattered and boarded a flight to New York, where no one whispered her name in sympathy. She wasn't running. She was starting over. For her son, for the life that had been stolen from them. Miami, 1 year later. The name Vivian Crawford once carried weight in Miami's most exclusive circles. A powerhouse in real estate, a woman who built an empire, a fixture at every elite event. Now, it was a name people only whispered, a cautionary tale of power, obsession, and a decision that destroyed everything. The mansion, where she had once hosted lavish parties, vacant. The business empire she spent years building, dismantled. The connections she once held, vanished. In the city where influence meant everything, Vivian no longer existed. She was just a prisoner in a Florida correctional facility, serving a life sentence for the murder of the man she claimed to love. For Layla Crawford Blake, the damage went beyond loss. She had buried a husband, given birth to a son who would never know his father. And in the process, she had lost something else, her belief that love and trust could ever be absolute. She made one thing clear. She would never forgive Vivian, not in a year, not in 10, not ever. The woman who raised her, the stepmother who played the role of a mentor, protector, and guide, had stolen everything. And for that, Layla cut off all contact. There were no letters, no calls, no visits. Vivian was dead to her. The story wasn't just another murder case. It was a scandal that rocked the very foundation of Miami's wealthiest circles. The same people who had once toasted champagne with Vivian, signed million-dollar deals with her, attended her private gatherings, were now distancing themselves as if they had never known her. The media couldn't get enough. A high-profile businessman murdered in his own home. A love triangle between a man, his wife, and her stepmother. A crime committed by one of the city's most powerful women. For months, headlines dissected every detail. Experts debated on talk shows. Psychologists analyzed Vivian's obsession, and true crime fanatics picked apart every clue. The question remained the same. Could this have been prevented? Could it have been stopped? Looking back, were there signs that no one saw? Did Jordan Blake underestimate the danger? To the outside world, he had everything: wealth, influence, a devoted wife. But behind closed doors, he had engaged in an affair with a woman who didn't understand rejection. Did he assume he could walk away without consequences? Or did he ignore the warnings until it was too late? And what about Layla? She had noticed the shift in her stepmother's behavior, the distance, the coldness, the quiet resentment. Could she have looked deeper? Would it have mattered? These were questions with no real answers. What was certain, though, was that one moment of obsession had destroyed an entire family. A legacy of consequences. Miami moved on, as cities always do. New headlines replaced old ones. New scandals took center stage. But for those involved, the damage was permanent. Vivian Crawford would die behind bars. Trey Coleman would carry the stain of his role in the crime. Layla Blake would raise her son in a city that didn't know her name. And Jordan Blake would remain frozen in time, forever remembered as the man who never saw the danger coming. A family shattered, a life stolen, and a story that would never be forgotten. Layla Crawford Blake stood at the window of her apartment, gazing at the city skyline. The lights stretched endlessly, a world that kept moving, no matter how much hers had stopped. She had left Miami, the whispers, the questions, the unbearable reminders of what was stolen from her. But the past wasn't a place. It was something she carried. Every day she woke up to a son who would never know his father. Every day she remembered the love she lost, the betrayal she never saw coming, and the stepmother she would never forgive. But she survived. Not because it was easy, not because she had a choice, but because she refused to let grief define her. Her story wasn't about loss. It was about what came after. This was never about love, not in the way love is supposed to exist. It was about power, control, the refusal to let go. Vivian Crawford didn't kill Jordan Blake because she loved him. She killed him because she couldn't own him. And when obsession replaces love, tragedy is only a matter of time. The questions that remain: could this have been prevented? Were the signs always there? Did Jordan ignore them until it was too late? Did Layla miss the warnings? Or was this a story that was always going to end this way? And then there's the question no one ever wants to answer. What would you have done? If you were Layla, if the person you trusted most had betrayed you in the most unforgivable way, could you have seen it coming? Could you ever move past it? Would you choose revenge? Or would you choose to walk away? The case of Vivian Crawford and Jordan Blake will always be remembered, not just because of the crime, but because it forced people to ask themselves, how well do we ever really know the people we trust? This wasn't a Valentine's Day story about love. It was a story about what happens when love is replaced by possession, when jealousy becomes obsession, and when the need for control turns deadly.